If somebody is coming to you and they're saying, right, I'm absolutely terrified about, this new process that we're putting in place. I know how to do this work and I've got the skills to do it now, but I don't know that I'm going to be able to do it when things change or with this new system. And you say, oh, don't worry about it. We're going to train you and make sure that you've got all the skills and training you need. That didn't address their feeling. It dismissed it and saying, don't worry about it. We're going to make sure you're trained. It's more of what I'm hearing you say is you're really worried and concerned that perhaps you're not going to be performing at the same level that you were before, and that maybe you won't have the skills required initially to perform at the same level that you have. I can understand why you might be feeling that way. I will work with you, and as a team, we'll work together to provide you the training. And if you have questions, I want to make sure that you feel like you can come to me with those.
Hey everybody, I'm Elizabeth Swan.
And I'm Tracy O'Rourke, and we're from the Just in Time Cafe. Welcome to our podcast. At the cafe, we wrestle with tough questions, we talk to groundbreakers, discuss great books, and get insights from Lean Six Sigma leaders and practitioners who are making a difference in the world.
We let you in on helpful apps, we bring you the news, and we challenge the status quo so you can build your problem-solving muscles.
So Elizabeth, what is on the cafe menu?
Tracy, there's a lot of very interweaving parts today. We've got our interview with April Thomas, and she's drawn on her clinical healthcare training background, and she incorporates the stages of grief into change management in the process improvement realm. So the stages are not linear, and we're going to delve into how they intersect with your average process leader. So for our book buzz, we're revisiting the classic book, The Switch by Chip and Dan Heath, brothers, who've written quite a bit together. And the cover has the iconic light switch, and we've all learned the hard way that change does not happen at the flip of a switch. And for Q&A, we asked, what are the most common change management obstacles you see continuous improvement professionals running into? So it's obstacles and obstacle management today, Tracy. We're all in.
Up next, it's Book Buzz.
This month's book is an oldie but goodie. And I know this book impacted you a lot, Tracy. So I'm really happy to go over it. And luckily, I took awesome notes when I read it. So it was really great. I gave myself my own refresher on all the stuff I took away from it. And the cover has that, classic on-off switch, exactly what change is not. But their analogy of the elephant and the rider is what really sticks with you. So do you want to describe that for our listeners?
Yes, absolutely. So just roughly, the Heath brothers have done hundreds of studies on how difficult change can happen with people that had little or no power to force the change. So I think that's a really interesting thing. And the entire book is based on that. So you hear about massive change that happened with people that had little or no power to make that change, which I think many people in process improvement arenas can relate to that, because sometimes people don't report to them and they have a hard time with getting buy-in from people. So the entire book focuses on 3 ways to make change happen: direct the rider, motivate the elephant, and shape the path. And direct the rider and motivate the elephant do require a bit of an explanation. And that's ultimately with the metaphor of the elephant and the rider that I'm going to talk to. So to explain the analogy of the rider and the elephant, the rider is the rational side of the brain, and the elephant is the emotional side of the brain. So the rider on an elephant's back is holding the reins and pulling one way or the other, and the rider can tell the elephant to turn, to stop, to go. The rider can direct things, but only when the elephant doesn't have desires of its own. So when the elephant really wants to do something, the rider is no match for him. Anytime the 6-ton elephant and the rider disagree about which direction to go, who do you think's going to win, Elizabeth?
Tracy, it's a tough one. 6 tons, you say.
So definitely the rider's going to lose. He's completely overmatched. And most of us are all too familiar with situations in which our elephant overpowers our rider. So if you've experienced this, if you've ever slept in, overeaten, dialed up your ex at midnight, procrastinated, tried to quit smoking, failed or skipped the gym, gotten angry and said something you regret or anything like that. So for example, I feel like with diet, most people know what they should be eating, right? I mean, most people know what they should be eating. It's not necessarily about knowledge, it's about motivation. You really know you should be having a salad, but you really want that brownie or the cookie or the cookie or but you know that you shouldn't be eating that. You should be having salad or something like that, but we're not motivated to have the salad is the problem. So that's really where there's conflict between our emotion and our emotional brain and our rational brain. It's similar to the writer, like needing a break from keeping the elephant in check all the time. It's way easier to get the elephant motivated. If you can motivate the elephant, then you're going to have a much easier time with change. So ultimately, that's really what the writer and the elephant metaphor is about. And it does explain the first two steps that the book switch or the Heath brothers talk about: direct the rider and then motivate the elephant. The third step is shape the path, which means lay out the steps to make it easy to make change happen. And they've got some great examples of all three of these steps. But I think the most important thing to remember, and this is where people forget, is if you want change to happen, you have to do all three of those steps. You have to direct the rider and motivate the elephant and shape the path. It's not one of them, it's all of them. And it shows in the book, all the stories show how they have done all three. So ultimately, you're right, Elizabeth. I am fascinated with this book. It has fundamentally enhanced my approach to helping organizations strengthen their operational excellence programs. And most of the time, it's because when I hear an issue about change, I think, oh, you didn't motivate the elephant. And they're like, what? So then I have to explain the analogy and I have to talk about direct the rider and motivate the elephant and shape the path. And, and here we are. And I'm like, just buy the book.
Okay, I totally appreciate you laying those out, Tracy. It just gives a really good construct for, how they delivered all these case studies. And what was fascinating to me is this one story I read really struck me because I knew the story. I met the man responsible for it. It was kind of fascinating. It was working with another firm, another consulting firm, Rath and Strong. Oh, I don't know, 100 years ago. And it involved a term that this consultant, Jerry Sternin, and his wife, Monique, they coined it called positive deviance. And the Heath brothers don't use the term in the book. They call it bright spots, but it's the same idea. And they look for what's working instead of focusing on what's missing or not working. And this case study was about saving children in Vietnam. There was a lot of malnutrition and a lot of children didn't make it and they had minimal resources. So they directed the writer, right? So I'm going to go back to your three. They directed the writer. They found women with healthy kids. And those women talked about specifically how they cooked with shrimp and greens they could gather when they were out there gathering rice, right? They gathered things while they were out there working. They also motivated the elephant that, what did you say? It was like 6 tons and it rules the day. So this is the big piece for them. The emotional piece was giving women hope, right? They could make their kids healthier and it wasn't that hard, right? So this great, giving your kids what they need and it's not gonna be too tough on you. And they shaped the path. So the women with the healthy kids conducted cooking classes and there was kind of some social pressure to go along, right? Everyone's doing it and the classes changed the culture. So just think about the money involved in that because there was none. And Sternin and his wife wrote The Power of Positive Deviance. So Tracy, if you want to go even deeper on this beautiful topic of, kind of how these guys manage that incredible change with so little resources. And I apply their thought processes by asking questions when I'm coaching, like, where is it working, right? You're dealing with this isn't working. Is it working somewhere else? And I don't know, that case study, obviously, for lots of different reasons, stuck with me. So which ones stuck with you?
There's so many good stories in there and some really good examples of very specific things people can do. And I think when you read the book, you kind of recognize some of the things that they talk about, like jumping on the bandwagon. That's an actual change management tool. Like everybody's doing it, you should do it too. There is power in that. So I think a lot of people, once they read this book, they will recognize. But one of my favorite case studies was around something called the 2% Milk Campaign. It was done by two professors at West Virginia University, and they wanted to do an experiment to change habits. They wanted people to eat healthier. And so they thought, well, where do we begin? Breakfast, lunch, dinner? And they ended up focusing on milk, which was the single largest source of saturated fat in Americans' diet. So if Americans switch from whole milk to 2% milk or 1% milk, they would be at USDA levels, recommended levels. They would be at USDA recommended levels of saturated fat. But what they discovered is that they didn't need to change drinking behavior. What they really needed to change was purchasing behavior, because what they found is that if the milk was in there, they would drink it. People would just drink it. They're not going to be like, what's this 2% milk crap? Or maybe people did, but they still drank it. So anyways, they isolated changing purchasing behavior. They wanted people to buy that skim milk instead of whole when they would shop for groceries. So anyways, they did a whole study, a massive campaign, and they decided that they were going to target having people buy skim milk. And so they kind of talked through what they were going to do. And directing the writer would be like sharing all of those calories, like looking at the calories on the back of whole milk and looking at calories on the back of skim milk and comparing the two in terms of where the fat was and the grams and the saturated fat. Really good information, but there's no emotion behind it. Right. So they decided that they needed to really speak to the elephant or motivate the elephant in these commercials. And so what they discovered is that the amount of saturated fat in one glass of whole milk was the same as 5 strips of bacon.
I can't believe that.
So they put in the commercial basically 5 pieces of bacon in a frying pan frying and basically saying, this is as much fat as 1 cup of whole milk. And that got people's attention, right? They're like, what? And so when you think about it, people were like, wait a minute. What do you guys want? You want milk or you want bacon? Right? Do the skim milk so you can have the 5 pieces of bacon. I mean, so anyway, they ended up changing behavior. It was successful. They saw a market share increase. It was 18% in those targeted areas before the campaign. And then after the campaign, it was 41%. And 6 months later, it held at 35%. So they had measures around how successful it was to convert people to drink non-fat milk, and motivating the elephant was part of it. And how did they shape the path? They basically said, the next time you go to the grocery store, buy skim milk. So it's sort of like shaping the path was that. So they hit all 3 elements for that as well.
Well, this is really great to hear, and it explains why there is 2% milk in my refrigerator right now. I had no idea that I had my path shaped and my elephant got hijacked somewhere, and that's what's in the fridge now. But I like the idea that big problems can be solved with small solutions, or a series of small solutions. That's got a very lean feel to it, and that's what we teach. You don't have to shoot the moon. But also, like where they focus, like in Vietnam, they had lack of sanitation, poverty, lack of water, other huge systems issue, but they have a great phrase. They call it true but useless information. That's such a fascinating phrase. I hold on to that. True but useless, when the solution was women who included crabs and greens in their cooking and showed other people how to do it. So none of those, realities made any difference. They put it out, there's a negative, positive asymmetry in a lot of organizations, right? They say we focus on the bad stuff and we neglect to pair our problem focus with the positive by asking, hey, what's working now? Right? And I like that. It's giving me a new slant on some of my coaching questions. So Tracy, thanks for suggesting we get back to this book.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still excited about this book years and years after reading it. So much so that I actually created an in-person course around it. That people buy the book and then we walk through it and apply the concepts in process improvement. So, for those of you wanting to learn more about management techniques, this is a must read. I mean, you don't have to take my course, but it is a must read.
I'm Elizabeth Swan, and you're listening to the Just in Time Cafe podcast. In a short while, you get to hear our interview with April Thomas, Lean Six Sigma consultant and grief educator.
Up next, it's Q&A.
Today's question is, what are the most common change management obstacles you see continuous improvement professionals running into? Tracy, what do you see most often?
So I think there's lots of, if I had to pick one, what I would say is, again, sometimes people assume that people are going to be on board and they're not. And then they act a little surprised. And they have this expectation that 100% of the people be on board. And then if they do any change management at all, they get like annoyed or something. So I think that's the issue. I think a little more specific to project work is I feel like they don't bring on people, right? So I think one of the biggest things I tell people when we're working the left side of the A3 is get agreement on the problem first. Get a agreement from people that this is a problem and that this is a problem statement that they actually agree with. And then also get agreement around root causes. When you discover that you have root causes, get agreement. Don't just jump to solution because people have no idea why you're bringing up the solution if they don't have agreement on the root causes. And I feel like people get really married to certain solutions. And then when they float it to people and they say no, now it's a tug of war on the solution. But in reality, it should be, if we've got agreement on the root causes, don't get married to a solution. We're gonna solve it together. But I feel like sometimes they are so rushing to solution that they don't get agreement on those root causes first. And then, it's a fight now about what they're going to implement. When in reality, it should just be around, I mean, if they're going to solve the root cause, do you really care that much? I mean, let's really think through how this will work. What about you, Elizabeth?
Yeah, no, I think you raise a really great point. And I always think about why don't they reach out, right? So that, and you're right, those three pieces are key for people to have agreement like, yeah, this is an issue, and yeah, that's why it's happening. And so, yeah, this is an obvious fix. So when you miss those critical milestones, then you get that complete disconnect and people going, it's a tug of war, as you say. So for me, I think about, team leads don't reach out enough, right? They take it on themselves. And I think about why they're doing that, right? They want to do a good job. And they don't realize that people want to help them, right? People are ready and willing. And once you ask them, they're interested, right? And they form a relationship with you. They want to see you succeed, and it happens really quickly. And then you can have those conversations you talked about, like the problem and the root cause, right? And it's almost counterintuitive, like asking people for help. It doesn't burden a person, right? When you think about people ask you, it actually makes me feel good when people reach out to me, for help, right? When we do good things for others, it releases dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter that's associated with reward, right? So I'll start explaining to people that I'm coaching, like they might be more inclined to seek help if they see themselves as a reward instead of a burden, right? Like I always think about like, why do we do what we do? So it's the neuroscience of continuous improvement, Tracy.
Yes, I agree. There's science behind this. So ask for help. And oh, by the way, I'm terrible at asking for help generally.
No, but and the other side of the neuroscience reality is what happens to the person who doesn't ask for help, right? Like you're saying, I don't. So asking for help triggers parts of the brain that are sensitive to social risk, self-image, emotional discomfort. It's a biologically and socially complex act that requires overriding, right? You talk about the elephant. This is where you have to override deeply ingrained instincts, to protect ourselves from judgment or rejection or losing control, right? I want to do this project the way I want to do it. And the good news is that our brains can be rewired. And we'll save that for another episode, Tracy, because I find that so fascinating.
Absolutely. You know what's interesting too is sometimes needing help is a mental state. Like I love to collaborate with people. I love to collaborate with people, but I don't like to ask for help. Like when I feel like I made a mistake and now I have to ask people to do something that I didn't expect them to help me with, that is where I struggle. But I love collaborating. So
Yeah.
it's maybe sometimes we need to just think about it differently.
Reframe it, maybe. Reframe
Yeah.
it.
I'm Tracy O'Rourke, and you're listening to the Just in Time Cafe podcast. We host these monthly, so you can go to www.jitcafe.com and go to our podcast page.
Coming up next, it's an interview with our featured guest, April Thomas. Tracy, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about April?
I would love to. I loved meeting April Thomas. She's a strategic leader who has a unique ability to turn challenges into opportunities. She specializes in helping teams build strong cultures, solve problems effectively, and create workplaces where people and processes thrive on their organizational excellence journey. She is dedicated to using her rich background as a social worker and continuous improvement professional to help individuals and organizations reach their full potential. April is a certified mental health first aid instructor, grief educator, along with being a certified Six Sigma Black Belt and a certified professional in healthcare quality. And all of those things sound very different, but wow, what a combination. We are honored to have April at the cafe. Can't wait to talk to her. Welcome, April, to the Just in Time Cafe.
Hi, Tracy. Hi, Elizabeth.
Welcome.
Yes, we are so excited to talk with you about what we think is a very interesting topic that honestly I would have never thought of until you mentioned it, that you talked about this at a conference, grief and change management. So, what first led you to connect the stages of grief with change management?
So, my background is as a social worker, and I started my career as a hospice and palliative care social worker, and end of life care was my specialty. So, grief and loss is something that for me ends up being a little bit more of a natural conversation because I spent so much of my career working with individuals needing to have conversations around end of life care, quality of care, grief and loss, both anticipatory grief and loss for individuals and their families, and talking about care planning, but then also on the side in terms of grief and bereavement. And so, as I was working in healthcare and became familiar with continuous improvement when I was working at Theta Care at Home, which is the home care and hospice branch for Theta Care in Appleton, Wisconsin, it became kind of this passion of continuous improvement and learning about how to utilize the tools. And over time, starting to see that, yeah, as much as I love I loved the tools, but I loved being able to help people grow and make system changes so that we could provide, the quality of care when people needed it. And being able to leverage people's talents is what I loved the most about it, so that I could utilize people to the top of their abilities. And started to see along the lines, there is this change that takes place with when individuals are, when we're looking at changing processes. And a lot of times we'll say, right, like in healthcare, right, people are resistant, they're non-adherent, they're non-compliant. And we start to use some of that same language when we're talking about change and initiating change, right? People are resistant, and starting to see this path and this correlation between, yeah, when we are changing people's work, there is grief and there's loss that takes place, and the behaviors show as resistance in terms of those feelings of grief and loss.
That is so fascinating, and it's what's interesting to me, and I think, is this all based on Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's original work, like on death and dying stages of grief, or is it?
Yeah, so actually no, and I shouldn't say no, yes, and partially. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross focused on the needs of the dying.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times we've taken that model and we've transitioned it to needs of grieving,
Ah,
but it's not necessarily the same. Grief and is a little bit different in terms of thinking about mourning and loss. So
ah,
I actually like Therese Rando's model of grief and loss better because she focuses on mourning. And so she has 6 stages, and her stages are reflecting on recognize the loss, how people react to the separation, recollect and kind of re-experience the loss, relinquish the past, readjust to the new world, and then reinvest in a new reality. So for me, I tend to lean more towards that model because I think it aligns for me and more with continuous improvement. And when we start talking about change management and loss and those experiences of loss, to me, Rando's model fits that better than
mm,
Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's model and the needs of the dying. I'm very familiar with her work and I think it's fabulous. And it's different needs, different time, different purpose.
yeah, that's okay. That's great. Thanks for clarifying that. And I'm taking those stages in because I feel like they're kind of positive.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
Yeah, and I think when we start to look at behaviors, right, when individuals, and I think about rando stages, right, people recollect that experience, right? How many times are we working with individuals through a change and all of a sudden they start to romanticize the process that weeks ago they were just telling us how much they hated and how difficult it was?
Mhm.
um, and where we see individuals, right, when they're trying to figure out, like, is this a fit for me? Is this not a fit for me? Right. That's when they're really starting to think about, can I accept these changes? And do I have the support and the training that I need to be able to move forward and kind of jump on that change trolley? Or is this too uncomfortable for me? And people then say, yeah, I need to transition to something different because I'm just not able to readjust to whatever that new reality is going to be in maybe my work environment based off of changes needing to take place.
Yeah,
Mm,
I think what is the most surprising still is I really see a lot of people just assuming people are going to be on board. It's almost like the expectation is everybody will be on board, and then people are surprised when they're not. And then they're seen as, oh, they're being resistant versus, no, this is part of the change process. And this is something that you need to be prepared for, that you need to be prepared to address. They're a little surprised and they kind of cop an attitude sometimes, like, why are you not on board? And in reality, I feel like these emotional responses are often overlooked. And why do you think that is?
One, it requires active listening. And it requires being able to respond with empathy and identifying where with their emotional response and where individuals may be at in terms of that change and that acceptance. So it requires that we have open up in terms of a conversation and some level of vulnerability to be able to really, like I said, actively listen and not so much just about the behavior, but being able to address the underlying concerns or fears.
Mhm.
One of my favorite phrases is, so what is the story that you're telling yourself, in terms of thinking about changes that are taking place? Because if we haven't had good communication, we're all really good storytellers in terms of catastrophizing what may end up happening. And so when we can work to be able to clearly communicate, but also be able to listen with empathy and respond and really truly meet people where they're at, it helps us to be able to work through that resistance. Because a lot of times, right, the behaviors are that nonverbal communication that something just feels like it's a no-go.
I think this brings up a topic Tracy and I discussed recently, which is that term resistor. There's terms we're familiar with. You brought another one up, non-compliant, people who are non-compliant, people who are resistors. And to your point, and Tracy just said, we sometimes people in charge of change cop an attitude, or like you're saying, we're not meeting the person where they are. And one of the things that Tracy and I did was change our language around thinking about stakeholders, that they're not resistant, they're just not there yet. And I feel like what you're outlining is a pathway, not just to help them get there, but also to view them. Like if you view them as grieving this old process, then you've got a different road you're going to walk with them than if you looked at them as non-compliant resistors.
Yeah, right, and I don't think people start out in the morning being like, I'm going to see how challenging and difficult and resistant I can be at work today. I haven't met anybody who says like that's my goal for it today. People
Yeah.
want to be able to do the best job that they can, but if they feel like things that are going to be changing are going to impact their ability to show up and do their best quality of work, I'm going to be hesitant about that and be like, okay, but am I going to be, if I'm not performing and meeting a particular quota or expectation, I don't want to lose my job and I don't want to get written up. So I want to make sure that I know what's expected of me so that I can perform to that. I think one of the other pieces in that is many times we've been at places as employees as well where continuous improvement and different philosophies have been implemented or attempted before. And when that happens, there is this type of armor. If you want to even just think about physically, right, this kind of armor that gets put on, people start to become more protective because they've also maybe been on change initiatives in the past that haven't gone well, or have left them, if you want to say, kind of scarred. And so they are going to maybe be more hesitant to jump in and be like, yeah, I am ready to hop into this new change initiative because in the past, like I said, maybe things in terms of change haven't gone so well. And they start being right where they are armored up, sword drawn, because they are going to protect their process that they have worked to, become highly successful and accomplished at. And they're like, I'm going to protect what I know because I don't want something bad or negative to happen to it, because we all tend to take a lot of ownership and pride in the work that we do.
Yeah.
And we don't want to see something not positive happen.
Yes.
I know Tracy's got a question, but I just want to say the imagery you just drew of the armor and the sword, and I feel like this battlefield with emotions strewn all over it. Go ahead, Tracy.
Yeah, no, what's funny too is, I've seen situations where people are totally on board with process improvement, on board. And then, they go through define, measure, analyze, or they go through the plan part of PDCA and they recognize, oh, we're the ones that have to change. No. Right? And so, but I think, to me, I think you raise a good point, is the listening part is to me about, okay, what's the real root cause of why they're resistant, right? So you're applying almost root cause analysis to why someone is resistant. Is it because of loss? Is it because of fear? Is it because of something? Like, I kind of feel like going through that process, and understanding that people aren't always going to be there, and knowing that will happen, I think is important. But I want to know, what do you think? So recognizing the stages of grief, how does that help avoid some of these common pitfalls or change fatigue?
Yeah, well, so I think it allows you to be able to understand and meet people where they're at and to be able to react and respond with empathy. I think those are really big and key things when we talk about, what does it lean and respect for people, but what does that look like and what does it feel like? Because people want to know that you're going to be there to help guide them through, and be able to support them.
Mm-hmm. April, do you have a story where acknowledging an emotional stage turned a failing change effort around?
So I think I've had some where it's more based on individuals, where there are things happening for them and being able to help identify and recognize where they're at, and helping leaders to be able to understand and how do you respond in a way that doesn't diminish or dismiss an individual's feelings. In the example and saying, right, if somebody is coming to you and they're saying, right, I'm absolutely terrified about, this new process that we're putting in place. I know how to do this work and I've got the skills to do it now, but I don't know that I'm going to be able to do it when things change or with this new system. And you say, oh, don't worry about it. We're going to train you and make sure that you've got all the skills and training you need. That didn't address their feeling. It dismissed it and saying, don't worry about it. We're going to make sure you're trained. It's more of what I'm hearing you say is you're really worried and concerned that perhaps you're not going to be performing at the same level that you were before, and that maybe you won't have the skills required initially to perform at the same level that you have. I can understand why you might be feeling that way. I will work with you, and as a team, we'll work together to provide you the training. And if you have questions, I want to make sure that you feel like you can come to me with those.
So when you do you ever, well, are you familiar with the change management model ADKAR?
Mhm. Yep.
So just for anyone listening that doesn't know the stages, what is it? Awareness,
Fire,
desire,
no.
Knowledge,
knowledge,
ability, and reinforcement.
ability reinforcement. So if you think about that change management model, do you have like an overlay for the stages of grief you described that fits with it? Or, not that that's the only change model, but just throwing that one out there, it's a fairly well-known one. Um, that or where the stages sort of occur most often, or do they occur throughout?
Yeah, so grief isn't a linear process. So
Mm,
it's not one of those, whether we're talking about grief and loss over a process or we're talking about grief and loss with an actual death that occurs, it's not a linear process. And so it's like one day somebody might be like, yeah, like I'm feeling okay about this change. I'm ready to reinvest in this new world. And then they're kind of like back to relinquishing and kind of reliving that past experience. And so it's not linear in the sense that you're going to go through each of those stages and it's going to follow in that order. And
mm,
it's not prescriptive in terms of time frame. Like you are going to feel like you're in stage one for 3 days, followed by being in the next stage for like 4 days, and in 28 days you'll have worked your way through this grief process. It doesn't work that way. And so it's I always just say, right, it's more like chutes and ladders. For those who are familiar with that game, is sometimes you're going to feel like, yep, things are moving along, and then other times like you get the slide and like you feel like you progress maybe has been lost.
mm,
And so I do have actually a slide that I created that kind of aligns those processes between the ADKAR model, just because it's one that more individuals are familiar with, but there's a lot of change management ones and plans that individuals can follow, and being able to say, right, where individuals might be at in those stages. So for individuals, right, like in that awareness stage, I think that's really kind of more where we start to see with the grief and loss model that that's going to align more with recognize the loss, right? You want to be able to promote awareness, you want to acknowledge it. When we talk about desire, that's probably going to fit more with like the recollect and the re-experience, like old processes. Knowledge again is going to be focused on how, relinquishing the past. Ability is going to be focusing on, are they adjusting to the new world, the new reality with changes, and then reinforce is going to align more with like that reinvest. So I think that's kind of how I piece them together in terms of seeing some alignment in where individuals might be at.
mm. I like your description of that it's not linear, and I've definitely had coach had people I was coaching that said this was going great. Everybody implemented it. We were doing it the first week. We got great results. And then I checked this week and they're not doing it. They went back to the other way. And I was like, yeah, that can kind of happen at any time. Like there's different modes, but I think being prepared and knowing, like you're probably educating people, this isn't going to be linear, right? Expect this to maybe go great, and then people are going to be, back into one of the stages where, they're romanticizing what they used to have and how great it was, even though they hate it.
And maybe wanting to go trial that back out and see, is it better than what they had been doing. But it's behavioral change, and behavioral change, just like I would say, right, the hardest S in 5S is sustain, because it requires discipline, and it requires that that commitment. And so anytime we're talking about changes that require behavioral change, it is hard to be able to maintain that until it becomes a habit. So part of it becomes, how do you make it part of the habit?
Yeah.
So it's not linear. The whole process is not linear, and every individual will have a different progression through the stages, right? I mean, so it's kind of overwhelming to think about, to say, wow, I mean, at any point, everybody could be in a different space. And I think what you said is really important too, meeting people where they are. So what would be your advice to a leader to not get overwhelmed, but be empathetic at the same time. So like meet people where they are, but not get emotionally exhausted either. Do you have any advice?
Well, so I think one is work on building those relationships with individuals, right? It's I think about it being like a trust bank, like a bank account. The more you work to be able to get to know people and to be able to build that relationship, the stronger that relationship is. I think that can also help when you have to have when you're talking about change in the communications and being able to respond is looking at how do you work to build those relationships from the very beginning in terms of getting to know individuals and being able to get to know how they maybe react or respond to change. And that's something I talk a lot in training within industry job relations is how do you work to build those relationships to be able to help with those changes that take place too.
Do you ever feel like Lean Six Sigma needs an empathy belt?
I think of it as being like one of those what we probably would now say is like a micro skill that individuals it's become more essential over time because we talk about changing processes and we use tools, but really the focus is people and how do we help people become like these amazing, creative, innovative problem solvers and being able to help really maximize their talents. And so for me, I think empathy for me just goes kind of like, yeah, we need to approach this with empathy and meeting like that person-centered strengths-based approach, because as a leader, I always feel like my goal is how do I help develop other people and help them see maybe what they don't see themselves as being capable of.
Yeah, nice, nice. Um, Go ahead, Tracy.
Well, I just appreciate the work you're doing in this world, April. I mean, you know, grief is hard. Both Elizabeth and I lost parents last year. Both of us lost she lost her mom, I lost my dad. Now we're parentless. Both of us are parentless and we've dedicated our book to our parents and all the lessons that they've learned. But, grief is a hard thing, but I think the more people recognize that it is a process in and of itself that people are going to experience, and creating some more awareness around it, I think is really important because there's pain there. And if you don't resolve that pain, whether it's a loss of a parent or loss of control in your job or loss of, power or whatever it is in a process, I think it's definitely underutilized. So I really
Yeah.
appreciate you bringing this to the table. And wow, I'm really impressed with the work that you're doing to help people, deal with their emotions
Mm,
professionally and personally. So thank
mm.
you.
Yeah. Thank you, April.
You're
And
welcome.
yeah, and I just want to say kudos to Tracy, in our efforts to find an April to talk to in our April episode. That you, April, were the one that emerged as a brilliant choice. Because Tracy and I are definitely, we just wrote a tool book, but half of it is about, all the non-tool emotional quagmires that you get into. So your focus is incredibly helpful. Is there anything we didn't ask you that you would like our listeners to know?
That is a really good question. Um, I think when we talk about grief and when we talk about loss and we talk about change, is that, and we were talking about resistance. I don't know about you, but I have a life outside of work. And for people, employees and people as well, they may be having things that are taking place and challenges happening outside of work that also impact their ability to maybe take on change that's happening at work. And so remembering that individuals are, people, and we have things that take place at work and we have lives that also take place outside of work. And that as, and as much as people may want to, be able to think about, yeah, just put it in a box, lock it up, put it on the shelf, go to work, when you get home, like unpack it. It doesn't work that way. And so sometimes challenges that individuals, or when we think about resistance or challenges with changes taking place, is that there may be other pieces that we don't necessarily see that might be impacting individuals and and how much change they're able to take on all at one time. Because,
Right.
when we think about people and change at work, right? When we're changing processes, they're trying to work and adapt to that too,
Yeah.
and adapting potentially to other things that are taking place in their lives. And so we know that performance is impacted.
Mm.
And that to me is also where psychological safety becomes so key, in creating those environments for individuals to be able to then feel like they could talk about, grief and loss that's taking place. Um, so
Great point. Great point. And great conversation. And thank you so much, April. We are going to leave. Is it okay if we leave a link to your LinkedIn address as a way for people to connect with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Love to be able to engage in the conversations, whether we're talking about change management and grief and loss, or whether we're talking about helping leaders build those skills for those conversations around
Oh,
grief and loss when it's around change, or even when we're talking about, how do you support individuals who have experienced a loss of a loved one as well. Open to those conversations because grief and loss is an area that I'm pretty passionate about.
yeah, clearly. Wonderfully done. Well, thank you so much for coming on the cafe. Um, and we hope to see and talk with you again.
Looking forward to it.
If you did not catch last month's podcast, we interviewed Zen techie Dan Zigmund, who recently published The Buddha's Office. He's worked at Amazon, Google, and Apple, and he knows his workspaces, and he's an ordained Buddhist priest. We also review a book about how to design transformational workshops. We'll leave you a link.
Awesome. And guess what? Elizabeth's book, Picture Yourself a Leader, just came out on Audible. Woohoo! And Elizabeth is the narrator.
Oh,
I never
yeah.
get sick and tired of hearing Elizabeth's voice, and you won't either if you get the Audible version of her book.
Well, you're so kind. Speaking of books, our book, The Problem Solver's Toolkit, second edition, just got its beauty treatment. It's beautifully laid out, and I applied something I learned during the recording of my audiobook. I read the whole thing out loud over the weekend, which surfaced many unnoticed mistakes. And this time, I was not surprised. Okay, a little surprised. And it's now even closer to being released.
I can't believe you still found mistakes. I mean, we've gone through that book like 1,000 times, right?
Read something out loud, Tracy. It's a completely other experience.
I bet. And tune in next month when we interview aerospace engineer and best-selling author John Gaspari about his latest book, If Engagement is the What, Then Respect is the How. Stay tuned for all the news by joining our community at the Just in Time Cafe.
Thanks for joining me and Tracy for another education-packed episode. You are our favorite thing about the Just in Time Cafe, and we look forward to being your lifelong learning partners.
Join us every month for your jolt of lean caffeine.